Hello class and welcome to Module 3. This week we're going to be talking about motivation, and that's something that a lot of you mentioned interest in when we did our introductions. So I hope that you'll be able to take some of these things that we're learning this week and apply them to your classroom or whatever work it is you might do. So we'll begin with a definition from Ormrod of motivation, because I think it's a good starting point. Ormrod defines this as an internal state that arouses us to action, pushes us in particular directions, and keeps us engaged in certain activities. So just from that definition, we can see how this would apply to education, as we want to encourage our students to go in a particular direction toward learning a concept, working with other peers, etc. And of course, we want to keep them engaged. So why else should educators care about motivation? I just put a few thoughts down here. We can use motivation as a way to determine how much energy a student is going to give to a certain task. We can learn which behaviors might be more easily reinforced based on what motivates a person. And we can then also learn about how students are processing the lessons we are giving. What is their actual cognitive process? How are they approaching the complex problems we might be giving them, etc. So the first step in motivation is arousal. We must be aroused to be ready to take on a task. So I've displayed this here as kind of a continuum. So we are asleep at one end, meaning that there is no arousal. We are in a resting state. In the low levels of arousal, we can be either relaxed or on the negative side, we could be bored. So in that stage, there's not going to be a lot of concentration on a certain task. Then on the far end, we could be overly excited or anxious. So we also know that that does not lead to better concentration on a task. So I've indicated kind of the sweet spot in this red box here, that we want to be aroused but not at either of those extremes for the best learning setting. I also want you to be aware of two types of motivation. You're probably familiar with these already, so this is more of a review for those who need it. So intrinsic motivation, I describe this as internal, so this is happening within oneself, and we might take on a task because we enjoy it, we think that it's going to be a positive experience for us, whereas extrinsic motivation comes from the outside, so there's some type of external source that is leading us to make certain choices, and tasks are done to achieve a desired result. When we think about behavior modification like last week, that's also extrinsic motivation, as we're trying to avoid punishment or because we want to receive a reward for something. So these two types of motivation inform us as educators about what our students, how they might perform in the classroom. So if we are able to get them to a level of intrinsic motivation, it is said that education, or the learning process will be better. So a couple examples. Intrinsic motivation, for example, I love to read for pleasure. So there's no reward that I get from an external source. It's purely within myself that I pick up a book and I end up enjoying the book. But extrinsically, I have to read for my dissertation. So I'm finding empirical articles about my topic, and I'm reading those. There might be some pleasure or enjoyment that I derive from that, but most of my focus is on the desired consequence, which is finishing my dissertation and graduating with my doctoral degree. So even though it's the same task of reading, there are two different motivations there. Now, you may also be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and we see Maslow here again. This gets at the concept of drive. So what drives us, what motivates us, And Maslow described our needs as a hierarchy. So the basic needs of physiological and safety items are at the bottom of the hierarchy. And then the psychological needs build on those basic needs. So you have belongingness, love, and esteem. And then finally, you have self-actualization. And Maslow's theory was that only 1% of people actually get to self-actualization. So a few examples of how this hierarchy might come into play in the classroom. Maslow suggested that physiological needs are the basis or the foundation for any of those other needs. So before we have security and safety, we need to have food, water, warmth, and rest. So for example, how can a student stay awake in class if they're not getting proper sleep or nourishment at home? Many of you might even come into contact with students that are homeless, or students that are coming from broken homes where they're traveling from one parent's house to the other, staying with other family members, and that can be very disruptive. As far as safety needs, what might happen when a student begins to skip school because they feel unsafe? Maybe they're being bullied, maybe the environment does not feel safe to them. That will certainly impact their attendance, and even if they are there, it would impact their concentration. And then belongingness and love, some students might struggle to make those friends in the classroom, might have trouble with intimate relationships, and so how might feeling ignored or disliked impact a student's concentration? And then finally with esteem, we know that students need that reinforcement. So they need to feel accomplishment, they need to be recognized for what they are doing well, and so that translates directly into the classroom. Now just a few more points about the hierarchy of needs. When we think about the connection between this hierarchy and behavior, Ormrod says needs that are satisfied most of the time have little effect on behavior. So if I almost always have food, water, warmth, and rest, I'm not going to be behaving in a way that suggests I need those items. I'm not going to be falling asleep in class. I'm not going to be seeking food wherever I can. I'm not going to be stealing. And so that's something to keep in mind, that if it's esteem needs, that might have an impact on behavior. And finally, I just want you to look at this bottom part where Maslow described deficiency needs. And so this comes in as educators. These 4 bottom needs are ones that we need other people for. So teachers can provide safety, belongingness, esteem, etc. You may at sometimes, be responsible for the physiological needs, but mostly that's covered by family, friends, etc. Or I put also the neighborhoods and government, as that they might be resources for the student. So just things to be attentive to in the classroom. And then finally this week we're going to be looking at 2 different articles. These are really good examples for your final project. So your final project papers could be kind of theoretical or review based, but I would like you to try to find psychological studies, so ones that actually have an experiment or some type of correlation or regression analysis. If you're not familiar with those things, that's fine, but I want you to use these articles as a guide for what you should be looking for your final project. So our first article, Meyer and Turner, is looking at the connections between emotion and motivation. And I especially want you to read the sections on flow theory and goal theory, because both of those are very applicable to motivation. And then the Young-Jones et al. Article is returning to that idea of bullying that we saw in the article from last week, but it's looking specifically at the connections between motivation and bullying. Now this looks at undergraduate students in higher education, so it's not as applicable to, say, elementary or middle school, but you could see how the same concepts might apply. So if there are any questions, please feel free to email me. Otherwise, we'll be reading these articles We'll look at a little bit about attributions and goals, and then you'll have your discussion for this week. So best of luck, and I hope you stay motivated.